There is no overarching statute today that says that companies that want to sell to the federal government must have adequate cybersecurity, or else they can't do business with it. It's a matter of regulation and contract clause, and at the moment, those apply just to companies in the defense industrial base, and they are achieved through that key clause, the DFARS 252.204-7012. DoD has chosen to use the acquisition process to influence and shape the conduct of its suppliers. But as we'll discuss, DoD has its own roles and responsibilities. And one of the most important of those responsibilities is for DoD to identify and designate, to make the decisions on what is or is not a form of covered defense information that has to be protected. Over the last year or two, as so much attention has been paid to CMMC and the DFARS, it's become awfully easy for some in DoD to say that anything that a company has that could be sensitive, including a company's own IP, has to be CUI. Well, for better or worse, I'm a lawyer, and my specialty is acquisition law, and I also know something, or hope to know something, about intellectual property and administrative law. And I don't quite see it that way. I share the same purposes as the department. I want to see more protected, not less. But I think it is useful, if not necessary, to be a little more discriminating in how we understand what is required, how it has come to be required, and what should be done. Let me move ahead 2 slides here.
So Bob, while you're switching slides there, I know you mentioned that Department of Defense has done this through the acquisition regulation rather than an overarching government-wide mandate, if you will. But are we seeing? I think we're seeing other agencies start to pick up on the same need, and for example, GSA and others are starting to pick up on this either through their use of CMMC or of other similar capabilities to push these same types of structures down into their contract environment. Do you believe that that's going to continue to grow? How is it going?
We are seeing other agencies pick on it. Way back in 2015, which seems like forever ago, I think I wrote an article for Federal Contracts Review that essentially made the obvious point that the DoD is the largest buyer of supplies and services off GSA Schedule 70, and it was a little peculiar that DoD was proceeding on this campaign to require cyber protection from its own contractors when it could buy a lot of different things of sensitivity off the GSA schedule without protection. That is still true. Now, that said, GSA has taken some important steps. It is set in 3 different new RFPs for multiple award schedule contracts that companies should be alert that they will be expected to or may be required to follow CMMC. But Scott, they can't actually make anyone follow CMMC until they have a contract clause in place, and that itself requires a new regulation. And the regulation has to be the product of rulemaking. And although the civilian agency counterpart to the 7012 DFARS has been in gestation for several years, it continues to remain just around the corner. Yeah. Still hasn't ever been put out for public release. Now, in another area that's a little adjunct to our topic today, it's very interesting that GSA has actually gotten out in front of DoD on another important area, and that is supply chain security. In the STARS 3 Astro, and I think it's Polaris RFP, what GSA has done is to tell companies that they're expected to assess their own state of supply chain risk and to prepare a plan and to furnish it to GSA as part of the solicitation, evaluation, and review process. DoD doesn't quite do that yet, but it is certainly a harbinger of things to come, because for all of its importance, intensity, and intention, CMMC is fundamentally about the protection of the confidentiality of certain types of information where this is required by federal law, regulation, or government-wide policy. CUI is not about the protection of the integrity of information or information systems, although it can help there, and it's not about protecting the availability of those systems, nor is CMMC about supply chain security. It doesn't really address hardware assurance or software assurance. those are things which really are important. And over the next several years, I think we will see DoD, as well as the civilian agencies, continue to do more to expand the expectations of federal suppliers to protect security in each of these different domains.
That's
So
really good.
let's talk about the gestation here. It's useful to have some context. And I do have to say that this is sort of the first time that I've taken this approach to slides, and I put a disclaimer on the first page to make sure that no one thinks that what I'm saying should be attributed to any former, current employer or any government agency I've worked for. And I do welcome feedback, good, bad, or indifferent. So, I've actually had some involvement with, CUI since even before the executive order in 2013. If you look at what President Obama ordered almost, 8 years ago, he said that federal agencies should incorporate security standards into acquisition planning and contract administration. Well, I mean, here we are approaching a decade afterwards, and we are still struggling with this. And then if we look over on the right, this is a slide from Vicki Machete of OSD from 2018. And it reminds us of the history of the 7012 clause. And it shows us also something of the history of the 171 special publication from NIST. So we've been at this issue for a long time. But we're still struggling, and part of the struggle is that we've never been entirely clear exactly what it is that we must protect. We've never been exactly too specific on whether there's any priority or distinction among the stuff that could be protected. And there's been an awful lot of murk, ambiguity, and perhaps deliberately accepted uncertainty as to those questions. Let's go to the next slide. When you read some of the current materials that have come out from DoD, you could get the impression that any information that a contractor hosts that might fit into any one of those many categories of controlled unclassified information must be controlled unclassified information, even if the government doesn't know about it, didn't pay for it, didn't provide it, even if it's not used in performance of a government contract, and even if it's used on factory machines and never sees the light of day outside of a particular manufacturing process. Well, I'm completely supportive of the idea that we want to protect more rather than less. And I think that any prudent business should do its very best to find any information of sensitivity, of course, including its own proprietary information, and that we should protect that because there's a loss of business value, there's a risk to shareholder value, there's a risk for liability if you were to lose the integrity or suffer loss of confidentiality. But that doesn't make that stuff necessarily controlled unclassified information, which is subject to the regulations that we are obliged to fulfill. So here I'm taking us back in time to the 2014 revision to the Federal Information Security Modernization Act. And I'm just going to highlight a couple of things here. It says that the obligation is for federal agencies to protect information which they collect or which is collected on behalf of an agency. Well, on behalf of an agency means you're under contract to operate an information system for the agency. A supply contract or a solutions contract doesn't mean you're operating on behalf of the agency. You're furnishing them a supply or service. It's different. And it also says that you have to protect the systems of the agency or by a contractor, again, those special terms on behalf of the agency. This is narrower legally, than what some might think. Now let's take a look over at the latest version of Special Publication 800-171. This revision 2 just came out. What does it tell us? It says it's driven by FSMA, and it requires federal agencies to protect this information, and it has to be done by a contractor of an agency on behalf or another organization on its behalf. It says that it focuses on protecting the confidentiality of CUI in non-federal systems and organizations. But we have to recall that the fundamental source of the obligation that leads to Special Publication 171 is the legal duty of agencies under FSMA to protect the confidentiality of federal information. And that becomes something of a constraint on just how broadly we can or should interpret the obligations that flow by contract down to companies. Let's go to the next slide. So let's take a look at the basic definitions. And these are things that everyone has seen many times over, but I want to spotlight just a few aspects. So it actually is far from clear when you look at these definitions in the 7012 clause exactly what it is to be protected. In fact, it's also not especially clear whose responsibility it is to identify or designate it. Let's start with the easy part, controlled technical information. That's information of military or space application. And in many situations, a DoD contractor will have a pretty good idea what is CTI, but not in all situations. Because if you're running operational technology in a factory or in a logistics system or in an IoT-enabled parts distribution system, well, it isn't exactly clear that the information is of military or space application. You may have no idea, and it may not, it's a question as well, just who is to decide that? But when you look further at that definition of controlled technical information, you see that it would meet the criteria if disseminated for distribution statements B through F of DODI 5230.24. Well, I can tell you that if I have a document from DoD and it's subject to 5230.24, the first thing I'm going to do is to look at the bottom of the document to see what distribution statement it tells me to follow. And I get some of those documents. And if it's distribution statement A, then it's free to go to the public. And if it's anything else, it's not. And in the wonderful world that doesn't exist, DoD would tell us every time we have CTI, and there would be no question about what it is or what it isn't, and we wouldn't have to search through accumulated inventories of vast amounts of information trying to see not just what has the distribution statement, but what might now be subject to the distribution statement if they had done it, but where they did not. So even as to this one area that's in some respects the easiest to identify, there still is this issue in that DoD has not, in all cases, or perhaps even in many cases, gone to the trouble of telling us whether it is subject to a particular distribution statement. In fact, we still continue to see new information generated, with that almost ubiquitous label for official use only. What is that? I mean, I've seen it a million times over more time than I would be willing to admit. What it is something that's actually not in the present registry of, appropriate or approved designations of controlled unclassified information. I might say unkindly that for official use only information is a marking that people use when they don't want to go to the trouble of trying to figure out which of the distribution statements applies and to go through the formalities of designating that information as is now required for DoD and other federal agencies. But that's still just the easy part of the problem. Let's get into the most difficult part of this definition, and it is what is covered defense information? Well, the first point, of course, that everybody will recognize is that, hey, this is all about CUI. So why do we have this distinction between CTI and CDI? I don't know. I know that CTI itself is one of the forms of controlled unclassified information that exists by operation of law, regulation, government-wide policy. Covered defense information is something else altogether that was created when the 7012 regulation was promulgated. And it starts with CUI, okay, and then it adds these two other provisions. And part one of the definition is the easy part. It's information that is marked or otherwise identified in the contract and provided to the contractor by or on behalf of DoD in support of performance. Well, if we just stopped there, we would have a lot less frustration and gnashing of hypothetical teeth. Because if it were like classified information, either there would be a responsibility on the part of the department to designate it properly and to put on the correct labels and cover sheets, or there would be people who are trained in using guidance who are authorized by a company under DCSA supervision to do the same thing. But we would at least know what it is. that's not how it works for CUI, however, because we have the second part of the definition. It is collected, developed, received, transmitted, used, or stored by or on behalf of a contractor in support of the performance of the contract. Well, a great deal of activity, frustration, uncertainty, and doubt all surround that part two of the definition. What exactly is used in support of the performance of a contract mean? If you know, tell me, because I'm never sure. And yes, it makes perfect sense, to say, I want to cover everything because the adversary will seek everything and they will mine and they will harvest everything. And that's all true. But it doesn't make it legally correct to say that anything a contractor has that might, in some respect, have some relationship to the performance of the contract has to be subject to the DFARS or to
Well,
CMMC.
Bob, isn't it just saying there though that basically if it's in the CUI registry, if that type of data is in the CUI registry, and then it is also collected, developed, received, transmitted, used in support of the contract, then it would be considered, CUI, right? That's what's
Well, yes, but who has to decide? Recall that under FSMA, CUI, the obligation of agencies under FSMA is to protect CUI. CUI exists as a function of the government, its laws, its regulations, and its government-wide policies. And if the government marks or otherwise identifies it, well, great. They have identified the information they must protect, and they've told you that you have to protect it. Perfect. But when you get into the part two definition, it essentially shifts the responsibility for figuring out what is CUI from the government, who actually owns that responsibility, to the contractor. And I challenge you to find many contractors who have people that are trained to identify and designate which of the 24 categories and 125 subcategories of information actually is CUI. It's never been the contractor's job to do that.
Yeah, that's really the rub, isn't it? Is that, contractors aren't trained data scientists. They don't understand information. They don't understand information architectures. They don't understand data tagging and labeling appropriately, right?
And it's a data governance problem. I mean, part of the issue here is that, we don't just sort of turn the lights on and look at what's in the electronic files and sort of have some person who will go through these things. We're talking not only about massive amounts of data that exist at present and is being used, but potentially all of the data that is in inventory, that is on servers or distributed within an organization. And there's not even a guide that comes out for contractors that tells you how to do this. Yeah. Nor, is there any counterpart for government, although they're working on it. DoD is working to improve the training of its personnel. And I think by the end of this year, they're supposed to have, better training and better guides. All good. But let's face the facts. I mean, the part two of the definition is intended to expand the scope of what would be protected and to expand the responsibilities of the contractor. And it certainly has, a good purpose. It's better to protect more than it is to protect less. But, I have to speak as a lawyer sometimes. It gets kind of far afield from the origin of the requirement, the responsibility that exists by operation of law. And there are some reasons to say that contractors shouldn't be held liable legally to identify and designate information which might be CUI where the government did not identify itself or provide it with that identification or otherwise give instruction.
So if, for example, let's say, we're here in Huntsville, there's a lot of missile testing that goes on here. Say ballistics data that may be created on the contract obviously was not handed to the contractor. The contractor's responsibility was to go do that test, gather that data, and then provide it back to the government, or maybe not provide it back to the government in its original form. But would not, that kind of data would, fall squarely in, the section 2 here of being collected and as part of the contract. So that would obviously be technical data collected on the contract that would fall under the CUI, categories, right?
I think that's right. But I do think we need to have a mechanism so that some of these questions can get, resolved in a more deliberate and objective sense. Part of the problem with the number two definition is the absence of objectivity or guardrails used in support of the performance of the contract. That's the proverbial bell-shaped curve. You could decide it's a very narrow category of things that are, say, collected in support, or you could decide that it's a very expansive category. And I suggest that of 100 contractors, you're going to get 100 different views of just exactly how to interpret that and how to apply it to the data that they have or employ in relationship to their contract. And if there are so many definitions that so many different companies can apply, all serving the same purpose and all acting in good faith, well, whatever you're getting is the inverse of consistency. And the absence of consistency increases the possibility of error, guarantees frustration and perhaps needless expense, and doesn't necessarily serve the department's interest. We need DoD to help us by giving us better guidance as a general form of instruction. And also, I think, by coming up with a way that recurring questions of let's call it CUI classification, can be asked and where they can be answered and guidance given in a form that's publicly accessible, so that we don't have every company or individuals within a company or every subcontractor making their own decision, which sometimes can equate to guess as to what applies to which of what they did, do, or have done.
And I think that lack of guidance or that lack of understanding from a data governance standpoint is one of the reasons why, so many contractors, just as you said, have said basically, okay, we're just going to protect everything because we don't want to, we don't want to be wrong. And so it's better for us to protect everything than to not. And that's kind of where we are as an industry right now is, default to its CUI and then just protect everything.
Well, I am only speculating, but it would not surprise me if people within DoD realized exactly that. I mean, now compliance is essential. You're making some form of representation of your security score when you submit your self-assessment to SIPRs. When the time comes to get a certification, you must be in compliance with the 110 requirements of the DFARS, or you're not, and the 20 additional practices and policies of CMMC are not going to get a certification. And so as people look at these obligations, they're thinking, wow, I can't afford to be wrong here. It's much better to spend more money and to protect more to be sure that I'm right, because I'm going to lose business if I'm wrong, or if some assessor decides that I'm wrong. No, all I'm going to say is that, I get that. I mean, I understand that there's at least an acknowledged ambiguity. There's at least an understood ambiguity, and it might even be purposeful here, because companies are going to resolve this doubt in favor of a bigger sweep of information to protect and a broader measure of protection. Well, okay, that's great, but it assumes that there are no other variables in play, and one of the other sets of variables are resources, your money, your people, your technical capabilities. And if you have an overexpansive definition of what must be included, and you are essentially trying to leverage uncertainty to produce a bigger result than is legally required, well, I mean, it might work, but there are going to be some companies for whom it doesn't work, and some companies for whom it can't work because they can't afford it, and some companies who are going to decide they don't want to try to make it work, and they'll exit the defense industrial base. None of those things are good. Now, look, I say later in the slides that, in a sense, the best answer in that perfect abstract world, not grounded by, balance sheets and budget, in the abstract world, the smart move is to say, I'm going to stop trying to figure out, where the sinecures are of covered defense information. I'm going to stop trying to find and identify an enclave, just that stuff that has to be protected. I'm going to apply the equivalent of the 171 or even CMMC level 3 to the whole of the enterprise. I'm going to raise the whole boat. Well, that is a great thing to say in theory, and I support that if you can do it. But really, not everyone can. It is not an affordable solution for some companies. And even if it could become affordable eventually, it may take us some time. And I continue to think we have to be discriminating in what we demand of contractors, and we have to be accommodating of the time that it will take them to accomplish the necessary security measures. And we need to remove obstacles or obligations that contribute a lot to expense, but don't contribute to security value accomplished. That's one man's theory. Now, this theory may be rejected by everyone that I work for, in which case, perhaps this will be my last seminar, but I hope not.
I doubt that, Bob.
So here we have the next slide, categories of controlled and classified information. I I've actually worked with a few of these categories for other agencies. So, NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration, part of the Department of Commerce, produced the CUI rule in 2016. That's, again, quite a while ago. And it was a prodigious effort to get there. I mean, there were, I think, more than 100 different variations of things that agencies and departments considered to be sensitive but unclassified. Almost, a circus of differing designations. And NARA did a great job in sort of herding the many cats, and it put together a registry, which not only gives the basis to identify two types of CUI: basic CUI, which is where everything has to be protected more or less the same way, and CUI specific, which is where a law or regulation tells you exactly what particular measures are used to designate and to protect. And NARA produced the registry. And the registry now has 20 categories and 125 subcategories of information. Well, that's actually changed over time. There's been more categories, and now there are less. There's been fewer subcategories, and now there are more. And the reason this is the case is that those laws, regulations, and government-wide policies, they are not static. They keep moving. Agencies can, do, have, and will decide that they're going to consolidate a couple of categories, or they're going to create new categories. Now, let's put yourself in the perspective of the contractor looking at this moving target. You're going to think, gosh, under that 7012 clause, I'm supposed to protect not just controlled technical information. Yep, there it is under defense. I got to protect all these other subcategories. Now, maybe some of them I never see because they're only agency stuff, but there are some that I could see. Those are in bold here. And how am I supposed to know? I mean, and even if I knew today, how would I know in 6 months if the categories have shifted some, or there's new laws, regulations, or government-wide policies? This makes it kind of hard. And this kind of illustrates our problem again. If you're going to take the responsibility for the identification and designation of these forms of information that must be protected according to federal law or regulation or government-wide policy, and you're going to push those off to the contractors, well, the contractors really are not in the best position to decide what exactly is or isn't any of these forms of CUI, even under controlled technical information, which is the one that, arguably is the easiest and arguably is the most important. And that allows me to make one other point. Let's look at across this board, of categories and subcategories. Now, the ones that I've highlighted are in red. Those are the ones that DoD contractors are most likely to see, and we should certainly be paying close attention to. And I put into bold a couple of other things that could turn up there. But, as you read across this list, you're kind of wondering now, wait a second. I mean, it has proprietary business information down there at the bottom. Well, does that mean that proprietary business information that I have, which the government had nothing to do with, that I don't use on government contracts, is that something that's CUI? I've heard suggestions from DoD, from OSD that it is. I don't think so. It should be protected. But is it federal information? Is it actually something where there's a federal law that says you have to protect it, or a federal regulation? I don't believe it. And one of the other things that bothers me is that in this press to be so expansive in saying that we're going to consider CDI to be both CTI and any other form of CUI and that other stuff we use in support of performance. Well, what we've done is to kind of dilute attention away from the stuff that really does matter most. Of course, every form of CUI, if you have it, does count. And if you have it and it's designated, it counts even more. And of course, certain types of personal information does matter because of the risk of social engineering. But this isn't about trying to do everything modestly. It should be about trying to do some things especially well. And from my standpoint, we might be thinking about ways to be sure that the entire defense industrial base does a much better job protecting CTI, because that information of military and space significance will have the greatest consequence to the department, to its mission capability, to its enterprise functions, if its confidentiality is lost. And I do have a concern that by spreading, the peanut butter, new analogy, best forgotten, spreading the peanut butter, too thin across too big a piece of bread, kind of looks right, but we're not really going to get quite the meal that we want. I'll abandon that analogy, but I think the point is made. Now, I want to spend a minute going through this slide on some legalities. And I've covered a bit of this before. Again, there is no statute here that says anything that we say is CDI must be protected by all government contractors. It's not there. This is done by a regulation. And it isn't clear to me that data which is used in support of contract performance is necessarily CDI or CUI just because you use it. One of the problems I have with this is that the expansive definition in the DFARS clause suggests that proprietary information that a company develops itself without government money, which the company owns, which it doesn't deliver, which it doesn't even use on a government contract and doesn't export. In other words, it's intellectual property, is treated as CUI. That might be something that should be a good law, but I don't really think it's the law now. I still recommend when I'm asked that companies should apply the best level of protection they can to any information of sensitivity. But if we are talking about compliance, there's good reasons to question whether the obligations are quite so vast as the DoD DFARS clause would suggest, and as has been interpreted by some. So I'm going to finish with a couple of propositions, and we've touched on some of these in the build-up here. Well, the first is that the DFARS itself was drafted 3 or 4 years ago, and nobody particularly liked those definitions at the time. That second part, information used in support of, was seen as problematic when it first came out. And I can tell you that age has not made it less problematic. So I think that DoD should consider a rulemaking to clarify what is or isn't CDI and who is responsible for it. And apart from changing the rule so that we're not constantly guessing as to the scope of the second part of the definition, we should also be thinking about the guidance as I described. There are so many questions coming up, and it's so hard to get answers from people who actually are trained and informed. Well, if that's going to be the case, it's sort of like the tax code. There are a million questions, and the IRS comes up with a way of publishing some of its decisions so that the practitioners can, see the history, see the record, and know what they can be informed by what's done in the past in similar circumstances. We need that. Now, here I'm going to go out here a little bit further. I get it that under FSMA, all forms of CUI have to be protected by law. But for DoD purposes, not all forms of CUI have the same consequence. And it's interesting to me that when you look at how the intelligence community or how DoD itself on national security systems or other major systems approaches security, it takes a risk-informed approach. That essentially means that I'm considering both the impact of a cyber breach as well as the risk that it would occur. But that's a little different than what we have today in the DFARS and CMMC. The DFARS says there's 110 requirements of 171, and DCMA weighs some as more important than others. CMMC says there's 130 practices and policies, all of which have to be met. Well, if I see that industry is struggling to actually get the job done, I might want them to do it perfectly for everything, but I would want them to do it faster and sufficiently as to the stuff that's most important. And I personally believe that what is most important to the DIB is CTI. And if we were to tell companies that we'd like them to start their journey by focusing upon the identification and designation of CTI and suitably protecting it, I think we'd be doing great if they improved upon their success in that initiative, even if it meant they were a little slower to go figure out what other forms of CUI they had. And at the risk of also extending myself further out on the plank, I get that federal contract information under the FAR Basic Safeguarding Clause has to be protected. And I know that probably the US government makes much too much contracting information available, and I appreciate that adversaries have much ability to get it and some ability to harvest it. But, we got to think about triage here. We cannot solve all security problems equally across all companies, simultaneously. Got to think about, impact, risk, threat, vulnerability, and consequence. So to me, what is most important is that we focus on level 3. it is important to protect controlled and technical information. There are forms of CUI, especially those that could be manipulated for human factor or human factors information. Sorry, there are forms of CUI that can be manipulated. Information about personnel can be used for social engineering and to attack, the human element of the supply chain. So we want to give that priority. But rather than spreading DoD's resources too thin or creating this massive apparatus of the CMMC, AB, and associated consultants giving apparently equal priority to level 1 and level 3, if it were up to me, I would say that let's concentrate our assets and our intelligence upon the identification of the information that needs to be protected at level 3, and let's make sure we get that to work. And after that, I would deal with level 1, which is less significant to me, and I would probably deal separately with levels 4 and 5, which present kind of different problems that are outside a common approach to a complex problem. I think we've got to, take the step across the threshold and have the same kinds of requirements extend to participants, to suppliers, to the civilian agencies. It's a fact, if anything, an increasingly important fact that DoD buys many of its supplies and services off multiple award schedule contracts from GSA and other agencies. We really have to make more uniform and broadly extended these types of cyber measures. And even if the purchases are by civilian agencies for purposes that have nothing to do with national defense, they too need to have security from their suppliers. They too have critical information, the exfiltration of which would do damage to the agencies or to the industries that they regulate or to the technologies that they promote. So we've got to get that the FAR CUI rule kind of out. We want to reconcile the way that civilian agency contractors deal with CUI with what we expect from DoD. Now, then I have my last and concluding remark. Well, when this all started some years ago, we were kind of coming out of nowhere and beginning to come up with ways to identify information types that merited protection or where protection was required. And we were also trying to think about, what subset of controls originally from Special Publication 853, what might be, just enough of the ones to apply to commercial companies or government contractors so that they would protect that important information. But we sort of started out with this idea that, well, nobody's actually protecting this stuff and they don't really know what it is. So we're going to kind of narrow the field of what should be protected, and we're going to take a small set of things. And then when we went from 853 to 171, we chose, NIST put out 110 requirements. Each were expressed in a single sentence. Each reflected a proposition that prudent businesses were already doing them. Well, we've kind of found out that wasn't the case. But the history, as I see it, is one where the government and NIST were kind of struggling to find ways to protect what they really must using just enough measures of protection. It was never the thought that we would compel companies to protect everything across the whole of their enterprise. But that was some years ago. And since that time, there's been such a long history of painful breaches, compromises, and other adverse cyber measures, ransomware, cyber supply chain attacks, and the like. And most recently, we have SolarWinds, which ought to concern, if not alarm, everyone, and for many reasons. I mean, really, today we're at a place where enterprise security is everybody's problem. And it shouldn't really matter whether you're a government contractor or not. And if you're a government contractor, it shouldn't really matter whether your DoD is your customer or any other civil agency. Are we at a point now where, we need to think about security as the expectation for any enterprise that does business with the government, or even for any enterprise that does business generally? Are we at a point where we need to set the expectation level higher? Should we be thinking about ways to move off of premises and to use, the scale and the technical concentration of technical resources in distributed or shared systems such as cloud? I think that SolarWinds ought to cause any company that's listening to this webcast, or any company in the DIB or that sells to the federal government, services or supply. It should make you think that, whatever you've been doing to attend to security, it's not enough. It needs to be done better, faster, and broader. And if that's the case, we got to be thinking a lot about methods, because we just can't proliferate, highly individualized, labor-intensive methods of being secure. We're going to get outrun by the adversaries time and time again, and that's no good.
Yeah, there's just not enough. There's just not enough people out there with the skill sets, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to protect 300,000 DIB companies to that level. There's just not a big enough workforce. So
Right.
you've got to leverage, platforms, AI, machine learning, et cetera, as you mentioned, to be able to do it properly. So, well, Bob, as always, a great talk. Always love hearing your perspective on these topics. You bring a different point of view than many of the others that we typically have in these conversations, which is always great because it keeps it fresh, and it also allows us to look at things a little bit differently. Most of us tend to look at these problems, solely from a technical standpoint, and you always bring kind of that legal flavor to it. And I always appreciate that. So thank you very much for joining us today. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to participate. And, I recognize that people may have differences of opinion, and I really do want to hear them. Everything in what I do, and most of us do, is a work in progress. And I'm not going to, vouch for the perfectness of anything that I've said. I do hope it contributes to our dialogue and helps us, down the path to improve security.
I think that's exactly on point. I mean, everything that all of us are doing right now is, we're practicing, just like how physicians practice medicine. We practice IT security, right?
Right.
We're figuring it out as we go along because the threat changes every day, just as human systems can change. The threat is changing daily, and we have to modify and morph and change our understandings on a daily basis, and you help us do that. So thank you very much.
Thank you.